So thank you all for joining us tonight. Hopefully you were able to catch some of our other events. If not, we did record them as well. So we encourage you to take a look at the Facebook page. We are facebook.com/equality242. Same thing with Instagram, equality242, Twitter as well. Yeah, I think that's it, right?
Yeah, thank you. So we're gonna just jump right in. We have Simmone Bowe and Ardra Manasi with us today. I'm not sure if Nalita is gonna make it, but if she does, we'll just introduce her when she gets here. Simmone, do you wanna start us off with your introduction? Just tell us whatever it is that you think we need to know about you.
Right now? Good evening, everyone, and thank you once again for having me as a part of this panel. Alicia, it's always good to be a part of anything that you're doing. My name is Simmone Bowe. I am a human resource professional, also a speaker, a coach, a writer, a mentor, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation tonight because this is a very important topic as it relates to violence and harassment and just having the right working conditions. The workplace should never be somewhere where you are in fear or you feel hostile or tense. But unfortunately, we hear so many reports of toxic workplaces. And so I think it's all of our responsibility, especially as HR professionals, to put a dent in this. And so I'm really happy to be a part of this conversation tonight.
Thanks, Simmone. And how long have you been in the HR field?
Oh my goodness, over 20 years. My specialty is actually learning and development. And so that's where I got my start as a corporate trainer and as an administrator of learning and development. And then I moved into as an HR generalist, we call that, where you have responsibility over an entire HR department. So all aspects of HR, I've been doing that fully for, I would say, about 10 years. So about 10 years of that time in generalist HR and operating at the strategic level, which is in senior management, where you get to hopefully influence policy and practice in the workplace.
So you're like good and ready for this conversation.
Oh, yes.
Ardra, can you introduce yourself? Tell us any very important things that we need to know about you.
Sure. Thanks, Alicia. Thanks for having me here. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Ardra Manasi. I'm currently the campaign manager for the Global 16 Days campaign at Center for Women's Global Leadership. Prior to this, I was working as a consultant for the United Nations. And my area of expertise involves gender policy, migration, and technology for development. In other words, I'm also a published poet. So that's all about me.
That's awesome.
And
like
yes,
the little fun tip, the fun thing about you. Yeah.
Thank you. I really look forward to this conversation, as Simmone mentioned, and it's very timely, and our campaign is live, and we've been specifically focusing on the convention. So look forward to talking more about it soon.
Yeah, and you are like in the hub. You're running the machine that is this global campaign. I think most people who are in the Zoom with us right now have been to a couple of events. You don't have to go into too much detail, but can you tell us about how the campaign has grown since 1991 and why there's a particular focus these years on women in the workplace?
Definitely. So I thought I'll just take you through the journey of the campaign. So the Global 16 Days campaign was launched in 1991 by Center for Women's Global Leadership. And since 91, we've been joined by more than 6,000 organizations in more than 185 countries. And that includes UN entities, NGOs, grassroots women's organizations, and governments. So that's where we are at right now. And ever since 91, we have had either yearly or multi-yearly themes. And in 2018, we adopted a multi-year theme, which was ending gender-based violence in the world of work. And as you know, in 2019, ILO adopted this Convention Against Violence and Harassment, C190. So it kind of coincided with that. And the main objective for us, more institutionally, was to bring together both labor rights and feminist rights movements with a focus on work. And it was the right timing for the ILO when we engaged with, the ILO process, because it again relates to ILO has been engaged in discussion on. I feel that it's a continuation with respect to, say, its discussion on decent work. And of course, violence and harassment against women, it has been a very persistent issue and it had to be addressed. So we ended up focusing on that. In 2019, our main campaign theme was Ending GBV in the World of Work, with specific action and call to ratify ILO C190. So even we had the hashtag ratify ILO 190. That's still one of our hashtags. So that's where it was in 2019. And as you know, in COVID, in 2019, it was the 25th year of the Beijing Platform for Action. And we're all going through a difficult time. And it's like all the gains that have been, we have attained so far, it's going to be reversed. We are in a situation where there's an economic crisis, where there is a labor crisis. And we realized that we should focus on informal women workers who have been most acutely impacted by COVID-19. And they're excluded from national labor laws. They don't have any legal or social protections. They don't even have formal contracts. And we are talking about 740 million informal workers, globally. So it was like they were already facing pre-existing vulnerabilities and COVID just heightened it. So that was the reason why we thought we should really focus on informal workers this time.
One of the things that I found really interesting in talking to Anya, who's also at the Center for Women's Global Leadership, and having a look at Convention 190 for myself, is the way that the world of work is conceptualized, the way that it's defined. Because when I first heard about the convention, I thought, oh, great, no violence in the office. I mean, that's good, but okay. And Anya said, no, you need to look at the definition, the way that the world of work is defined. Can you talk a little bit about that definition?
Definitely. So, that's my favorite part of the convention. It doesn't use the word workplace, but it's the world of work. So we are talking about the entire universe. Could you please pull up that slide for me? The world of work. I thought I could just go over the definition. Oh, yes. So the ILO Convention 190 defines workplace in this very broad term. So it's not just about your physical workspace, but it talks about workplace including public and private spaces. And I think this is very crucial for informal women workers, for instance, street vendors. So for street vendors, their workplace is the public space. And the convention actually talks about that. Then it talks about in places where the worker is paid, takes a rest, break or a meal, or uses sanitary washing and changing facilities. Again, it becomes broader there. Then it talks about during work-related travel, training, other social activities, through work-related communication, including those enabled by information and communication technology. And that offers more scope for online violence in that space. And in employer-provided accommodation and then commuting to and fro from work. So I think this whole universe of definition, and it really applies to different sectors, different contexts as well. And especially in the wake of COVID, we know that all over the world, domestic violence cases have gone up. And ILO Convention also talks about domestic violence in the sense that it considers domestic violence as a workplace issue. So just extending this definition, and I was just talking about that. So in the context of COVID, I think we have to understand, how do we conceptualize violence? Yes, domestic violence is happening, but in the workplace, is there more online violence? I think those are questions to be investigated within this very broad definition of work.
Simmone, when you look at this definition of work as an HR professional, is anything jumping out at you? Does anything really excite you about the way that it's being defined?
Well, I was actually sitting here thinking that it's so comprehensive. And I love that because you need that specificity because people will argue that if some actions take place, well, it only took place here. So if it took place there, then it doesn't count. And so I love the fact that it's very, very broad, including, for instance, in A, public and private spaces, B, where people are taking a break, you know, washing and changing facilities. So places where you would not normally attribute to a workplace, but they are spaces where harassment may happen and may typically happen. In actual fact, I remember having to deal with a case once that took place in a stairwell. It took place in the stairwell at work. So a young lady took a break and she was just sitting on the stairs and a colleague came up those stairs, met her there and, you know, touched her inappropriately and so forth. And the unfortunate thing with it is that it was in one of those areas where there was no surveillance. There's no surveillance cameras. And so now it really becomes it makes the investigation a little tricky, but you just have to take as many statements as you can from people that may have been around or seen how she would have responded and what would have happened. And that's really how the case was handled in a situation like that. So for me, I'm grateful to see the variety of spaces that have been defined.
I thought it was really great that it includes commuting to and from work.
Yes. Now that was surprising.
People using public transportation. And then I immediately thought about people who work in the tourism industry, particularly doing shift work at hotels, getting off at late hours. And a lot of people are just kind of catching rides with colleagues because here in the Bahamas, buses don't really run past sunset, basically.
No. And we had a similar issue. It didn't happen with between colleagues, but it did happen to a female worker who was harassed on her commute. And it was so traumatic for her that she came in requesting, I need a different shift. I need something because even though there was transportation provided, the transportation doesn't drop people off right to their door. So there's still this element of having to walk a distance to get to your home, which creates that element of danger. And that happens for both genders, actually, at least, you know, male and female. So I've seen where both have had some form of violence or harassment happen in those cases.
Yeah.
So that's really groundbreaking.
Yeah. And I'm wondering with the convention, I know we're only looking at this one definition right now, but I'm wondering what the convention is going to look like in practice. If this is the scope, which is a pretty large scope, Ardra, do you have any idea how this is supposed to be operationalized by governments and by employers?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, definitely. Again, ILO convention, I think it should be read in conjunction with recommendation 206. It's non-binding, but it provides detailed guidelines on, how we can implement many of these provisions. So recommendation 206 along with the ILO convention 190. So talking about employers, yes, the convention lists specific responsibilities for governments to put in place laws, regulations, uh, and various policies. And it talks about please, yes, it talks about holding employers accountable to these different measures, and also talking about not just creating policies but also following up through enforcement and monitoring mechanisms. Then governments should be like investigating many of these cases through labor inspectorates. So all these provisions are clearly mentioned in the convention, and developing tools to create awareness in accessible formats about this convention, and also rights of employers, rights of workers, So creating more awareness on that front, and providing support for victims, and providing access to remedies, and that involves like dispute resolution mechanisms. Then it also states Article 10 of the convention clearly states that the privacy of the complainant has to be protected, and any retaliation against them has to be, dealt with. So these are all government responsibility. And I mentioned about recommendation 206 earlier. 206 gets into more details where it talks about courts with expertise in handling, violence and harassment should be established. Then certain remedies, say right to resign with compensation. So remedies of that kind can be established. Then providing emergency services, psychosocial support to the victims, counseling services, establishing hotline, centers, crisis centers. Uh, then again, I mentioned earlier that domestic violence is also a workplace issue in the convention because it clearly affects women's right, productivity, safety, health, everything. And again, recommendation 206 talks about granting leave for victims or arranging flexible work mechanisms for those who are facing domestic violence. So what can their employers do to help them in the workplace? So these are some of the responsibilities of the governments. And coming specifically to employers, Article 9 of the convention gets into more details there. So it talks about employers should take appropriate steps. So already if governments have put in place national laws and policies which can hold these employers accountable. So they should adopt a workplace policy on violence and harassment. That's one of the suggestions there. And they should look into occupational safety and health is another one. And here I need to talk about again about informal women workers. And many of them face occupational health and safety concerns, which has negative, outcomes on their reproductive health. For instance, waste pickers and agricultural workers. Even in the wake of COVID, they have continued to work. For instance, waste pickers, they have continued to ensure public safety at the cost of their own, health and safety. They don't often have protective gear, and they're excluded from all these, healthcare policies. So employers should put in place, occupational health and safety measures. Then another responsibility listed in the convention for an employer is assessing the risk of violence and harassment with participation of workers and their representatives. And lastly, of course, creating more awareness and developing, training modules and for prevention, protection, and also enforcement. So covering all these areas. I know it might sound very technical, but these are some of the detailed provisions within the convention. And as I said, it has to be read in conjunction with recommendation 206, which really is a great roadmap for what we can actually do.
Yeah, so that's, like you said, it's a lot of technical information. So Simmone, it would be great if you could come in here and tell us a little bit about the kinds of cases that you've seen when people bring a harassment case. What does that look like? Do people tend to come forward right away? Do people come after a few incidents? What do the scenarios typically look like if there is a sort of typical scenario?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of what you've said. I think sometimes people see, and for us in this side of the world, as you know, this is something that you've advocated for years now, that some of this is cultural behavior. And so I think people and women particularly build up a resilience, so to speak. So I think sometimes there may be cases where people try to handle it on their own and they try to say, I don't like that, don't do that to me, that type of thing. And so there may be a few instances, and then it just gets to that boiling point where people would come and report that, because some of it, and I've been in the, when Ardra said training modules, I was shaking my head vigorously because that is such a critical element. And when she said it, I was just thinking back on all of the sessions that we would hold and the responses that you would get when you're laying out what is harassment. And people are saying, no way, that's not harassment. That's just, and you should welcome it. And that's just complimentary and all of these things that people comment on. So they don't even see it as an issue. And so people try, as I mentioned, to handle it on their own. And then it gets to a point where they can't anymore, or it's so egregious to them that they need to bring it forward. Typically, the issue is, or the process is, they would either report to their direct supervisor, or it's reported directly to human resources. And it should be handled, of course, confidentially. An investigation must be held. And then based on the results of the investigation, then whatever other disciplinary action would take place. In some cases, the police may have to be called in depending on how violent it may get. And I've seen cases where it's followed that due course, and based on the evidence provided, the perpetrator was terminated from the job. Now, it would depend on the victim if they wanted to pursue that in civil court or so forth. But typically, I've not seen that to happen. And as I've mentioned before, I have seen it on both sides of the coin, where people are being harassed. I do feel, however, that we must have some measures to protect people that report these cases, because sometimes there is retaliation for the people that report, and the protection is for the perpetrator depending on who it is. And so normally, if it is a senior leader, for instance, it's something then that we want to get that complainant out of the way. This is a troublemaker. This is someone who's problematic. They're crazy. They're imagining things. So let's get rid of them, get rid of our problem. But yet our problem actually is still remaining on the job. So that's typically the process, but I do see where we need more protections, and we need some way of ensuring that companies have this in place, because you'd be surprised to know, not just the informal workplace, but a lot of small businesses that don't have policies that speak to this. And they may not even have a grievance procedure or a way for people to report it and to have it dealt with. We need training for managers to know how to deal with it and how to enforce proper workplace behaviors during work shifts and so forth in their presence. We also have, as you mentioned, this virtual space where people are working remotely. And so what are the behaviors that we ought to be exhibiting even in this virtual space?
I'm just grabbing some relevant articles to drop in the chat for people as you were
You're so
talking.
good at that.
You were mentioning the need to protect people.
Yeah.
And that is in Article 10 of the convention. Section 4 says protection against victimization or retaliation against complainants, victims, witnesses, and whistleblowers.
Yeah.
And then to your other point on policy, Article 7 actually speaks to involving workers in the development of these kinds of policies. Mm-hmm. And what you said is so true. Small businesses, a lot of these businesses start as family businesses, and then they start hiring more people, and you have, 10 people, and then it's 20, and then it's 50, and they're still considering it a small business. And as the business grows, their structure isn't really growing with it.
That's right.
Protections are not growing. It used to be protected because it was just mom, pop, and the 2 children, Mm-hmm. How do we get to the place where we actually formalize some of these things?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because a lot of companies don't even have HR. So they may have an office manager, or like you say, they may have a family member that just handles what we call that office stuff, payroll and making sure people are hired and doing those compliance type things, but not this. I think ought to be a part of compliance somehow. And I think this is from the governmental level, and having more structures in place to audit companies. So in the same way, I know that we're tightening up on certain things, especially with our national insurance, making sure people are having that paid up and making it contingent. If you want to renew your business license, then you have to have, and I think we may need to start adding some more things to the checklist. So if people want to renew their business license, for instance, or if you're applying for certain work permits and things like that, that we should be able to come in and do an audit and see if you're actually actioning these things and is workplace practice. And I know private sector and private enterprise may say, well, we don't need the government interfering in our business operations to that extent, but these are very serious issues that impact everyone. So it would be very interesting to see how on the ground we can implement these things.
Yeah, and I guess another question that I have for both of you and everyone else here, and everyone feel free to jump in the chat. And if you have, questions or anything, you put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll come to you and you can unmute. But I was thinking about the whole ratification process and the fact that most conventions and declarations and all these international mechanisms that the Bahamas signs on to are not done by agitation. It's not us as citizens or residents saying, you need to sign this. It sort of happens in these other spaces and we don't really know anything about it. But I think that this is something that we should really be calling for the government to ratify, because it's so necessary. I mean, we just saw, I don't know if y'all are paying attention to the news, a couple of months ago, there was a report in the newspaper about a DJ on the radio who was being stalked. And it was related to her employment. So when I first read Convention 190, I thought this speaks directly to the situation that this woman was dealing with. But, she's a DJ, and, now a lot of the radio personalities go on live on Facebook. So it started with this guy just sending her messages on live, and then it started to get like more and more strange and inappropriate. And then he started showing up at the station looking for her. He started asking people in buildings nearby which car she drove, all these different things. And she called the police, and the police basically told her, well, he hasn't committed a crime. And she was sort of stuck just asking her colleagues to, male colleagues, to walk with her to the car to make sure she was safe. But even in her car, she's afraid to go straight home. So now I've gone off track. I'm going to come back to ratification, but Ardra, using this convention, how could we use this convention in cases like this, essentially?
Yeah, Lisha, I think here I need to go into some more definitions, and following up with what Simmone was saying, the types of, I think we should also talk about the types of violence and also who is a worker. So these are two very important definitions in the convention, I think, which we'll actually come to your ratification question as well. So could you please help me with those slides? So yeah, it's interesting that, again, it has ILO convention, it has a very broad definition of who a worker is. So here, initially, firstly, we are talking about employees as defined by national laws, and then persons working irrespective of their contractual status. And that's very important, especially for, again, informal economy, because many of them do not have a formal contract. So yeah, it covers both formal and informal sectors that way. Then we are talking about volunteers, job seekers, and job applicants. So you don't really have to be there. You can be an applicant being harassed, maybe online. Then persons in training, including interns and apprentices as another category. Then workers whose employment has been terminated. And then persons in, sorry, I'm not able to view the slide entirely.
You should be able to sort of drag on the right where you see all the different people. You can sort of drag that window out of your way. Can you? Or Lauren, what you're doing works too. Just moving it over to the left.
Okay. Yeah, I think I've pretty much covered everything. The last one is individuals exercising authority, duty, and responsibility of an employer. So again, it's just this broad framework. So we are talking about workplace and public and private spaces, about a worker, we are talking about people without and with contracts. And in addition to that, the convention specifically talks about situations of vulnerability. And I think here it's important to talk about that, because you know that like in workplaces, there is an unequal like power relationship, and women already face many stereotypes. And it's important here to talk about intersectionality at workplace. Say the situations of vulnerability. I mean, the convention and the recommendation says that it has to be read in conjunction with the existing international standards. So by that, we can maybe extrapolate it as, say, women workers belonging to ethnic and racial minorities, migrant workers, women with disabilities, or women workers with AIDS or other health conditions. So it's this broad spectrum of situations of vulnerability as well. So I was just kind of again talking about worker in situations of vulnerability. And the other thing is the types of violence and harassment the convention talks about. So it talks about a range of unacceptable behaviors and practices, and it can be physical, psychological, sexual, or economic harm. So again, it just provides this broad spectrum, and it includes gender-based violence and harassment. Means, I think the convention again goes to a sub definition of that, where you're just harassed because of your gender or sex. So that is gender-based violence and harassment. So again, I think this is a very broad framework. Read with all the three definitions that we discussed today, I think it offers a great scope for both workers in both informal, formal sectors in any context for that matter. And coming to your question about ratifications, yes, uh, the convention is going to come to force next June, like June in 2021, and two countries have ratified it, Fiji and Uruguay, which made the convention come into force. And also, I think Argentina has currently it's in the process of completing the ratification process. So yes, who is next? Let's see who is next. And the other thing is, we don't really have to wait for ratification to actually employ this convention, uh, and maybe just to expose human rights violations. I'll just cite an example there. The University of Miami's, they have a human rights clinic, and they, in partnership with other organizations, so they usually submit universal periodic reviews to the UN with reporting on human rights conditions. So they used this convention. So of course it's not ratified by the US, but they used the convention as a framework to actually document human rights violations against migrant farm workers and domestic workers in the US. So yes, activists needn't really wait for the final. Of course, that's where we want to go to the ratification route. But yeah, we can start applying the convention and all these legal frameworks. Employers can actually adapt these policies already and create workplace policies for violence and harassment already. So yeah.
We have a couple of people who are in positions of leadership in workplaces in the Zoom. I'm hoping that you all will chime in, but I'll start with Simmone about this question of maybe we don't have to wait until ratification. And I often wonder how we can compel businesses, places basically in the private sector, to be the first to do something, to set the tone. And sometimes I think that it might be easier to work with organizations that are based elsewhere and that have really bought into corporate social responsibility. And sometimes I think it might be easy to work with some small businesses, because sort of somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who owns it, right. And maybe you can talk to them right. about doing it. Yeah. In your work as a human resources expert, do you have any insight about how we convince employers to buy into this convention and protecting their employees from harassment and violence in the world of work?
Yeah. One of the things that I had to learn as I moved up in management was the language of business, which is what the language that executives and leaders and owners speak. And a part of that is data and coming up with the numbers and how those numbers impact their bottom line. And so we may not be able to come from that place of advocacy of this is wrong and you should protect your workers because they may not care. I mean, it's a sad truth, right? So we have to look at, as mentioned before, productivity, time away from work, cost to the company when people have to take time off work or sick leave because of traumatic events, using the EAP program, uh, all of these things that become now a heightened cost to doing business. So these are the impacts. Oh, sorry, that was some HR jargon there. It's Employee Assistance Program, EAP, and it is what some companies, it's a monthly subscription or annual subscription service to counseling, coaching and counseling. So you would pay either companies that actually specialize in that, or you may contract the services of a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And based on what you pay, you can pay for, sometimes you may get, each employee may get 3 sessions with a counselor. And then anything beyond that, they can pay for themselves. Or sometimes the medical program, the group medical program may pay for counseling in certain instances as well, right? So you have those costs that may escalate as a result of these cases of harassment, and you can measure a lot of those things. You can measure how people feel at work. If you can do a health and safety survey with staff and see, do you feel safe? Do you feel harassed in any way? And ask those questions, because as they always say, the numbers don't lie. Well, they shouldn't, right? But that's what leaders understand, more so than the heart aspect of it. The compassion aspect of it may not be an easier sell.
Yeah, Erin just said in the chat, a national gender index to incentivize healthy work culture. So
Exactly.
that connects right to what you were talking about.
Exactly. And we need more studies. We can't keep depending on, and I think they're not taking those numbers seriously because they know that we're not quoting our own numbers when we're quoting numbers from everywhere else in the world but our own. So we need to have more research, more statistics to support these initiatives, and why it just can't be, it's international pressure. We can't keep going along those routes. So we have to then make it a safe space for people to report, and for them for employers to take it seriously, and to deal with the cases that are reported, and to do proper investigations, to document actions. Because sometimes people, I've had a lot of cases where people just, they want to just get it off their chest, they want to confide, and I would say to them, hey, what do you want me to do with this information? It's no good if you just want to come in and vent about it, and then this person is just continuing to do the same behaviors, if that is the case. So we just have to create an environment. And I think when Ardra said that this is a framework, you don't have to wait. This is a perfect framework to create company policy. You have the freedom to do that. Use the framework, use the language, create the policies and implement it. So I think as HR professionals, we need to do a better job of that, of advocating within our own organizations. I think we need to lobby to the ministers and ministries of labor, and to our chambers of commerce and all of these other groups, professional groups. We should do a campaign and go around and speak to these groups, speak to civil society, and make it a priority, not just a once a year activism. That this is things that people have to deal with every day. How do we create safe environments for everyone?
Yeah, that would be really, is there a human resources club is coming to my
association. Now the fact that you have to ask that is terrible. But yes, we do. It's called, the acronym is BSHRM, Bahamas Society for Human Resource Management. B. Sherm. Yes. So we do have that association, and then I'm a part of 2 other regional associations as well. We have a Caribbean Society for Human Resource Professionals that actually just started this year, with last year. So it's 1-year anniversary this year. And then we have a community of HR, regional HR professionals called Carib HR Forum. And it's more of an information exchange, but I think we create a lot of awareness when we are sharing among each other, and we're sharing best practices and so forth. So they're all great platforms to advocate.
Yeah, I think those could be really great avenues to pushing for this framework to be used even before it's ratified, and also thinking about the unions, right?
Yes, they need to be partners. Absolutely.
Yeah. Lauren, you had a question.
I did. However, I suppose it's more of a comment. I attended a workshop today on human rights through the SDG unit with the Office of the Prime Minister. So I'm, fresh off of all the acronyms. And I guess my comment really is just that it might be more powerful for organizations and companies to not wait, because what we've seen with the ratification of other conventions is that they're sometimes just treated as a formality. And I mean, states are very slow to take the actions required to actually implement the various clauses and the provisions and realize the goals of these conventions, right? And so I think it would be very exciting to see a movement around this convention that is really driven by employers, because if we wait for the state to ratify it, we might be waiting 30 years for it to actually be realized.
Others in the room, feel free to bring your questions and comments as well. Ardra, you wanted to add something, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I completely agree with Lauren, and Simmone was actually talking about, starting with that activism where we can actually reach out to labor ministries. So on that front, the Global 16 Days campaign, we have released a campaign advocacy guide, and it has some action items. I'll share the link in the chat box. So it has an action items where we specifically, we provide a draft letter that you can just, download and write to your ministries. So that's already there as part of our activities. And the other thing is maybe writing to UN human rights mechanisms about some of these violations that's happening in your countries. And again, the action item has details on how you can actually write to them directly. If you see that, their worker rights, I mean, I'm speaking mainly for informal women workers this year, but their rights are violated, you can document them and write to these organizations. And just wanted to add, yes, in terms of waiting for ratification, there are so many existing conventions and treaties. For instance, CEDAW, Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And CEDAW is the most ratified international treaty, one of the most widely ratified treaty. And CEDAW already has like great frameworks. It talks about right to social security, right to equal opportunities, right to like non-discrimination, say in terms of women, like say maternity leave and other provisions. So it has these detailed guidelines already. So we already have these international frameworks in place, and that can be used now in conjunction with, ILO Convention 190. And if you specifically talk about informal women workers, there is Domestic Workers Convention, which is C189. Then there is Home Worker Convention, which is C177. So we don't have a dearth for, all these international legal instruments. It's all about how can we actually repackage it? How can we actually use it to advocate for some of these rights? And here again, I am reminded of home-based workers. They provide, like they are the invisible workforce for many of these international clothing brands. And with COVID, I mean, their orders have been canceled. They don't have, and they're even hired by intermediaries. So they don't even see who their final employer is sometimes. So in such situations, yes, I think we should start using some of these instruments very actively. Yeah.
You just made me think about there being so many women who are doing unpaid labor. Some doing it full-time, some doing it on top of their full-time work, and some just sort of doing it in between, right? So you have people who are taking care of their parents, people are taking care of their children, their spouses, domestic tasks. And we know that domestic violence is a serious issue and that it's covered under the convention. Convention 190 specifically speaks to domestic violence, but there's no employer to report to. So what would use of this convention look like for a person who is experiencing violence or harassment in the world of work within their home? How would they go about, would this have to be specifically in legislation for it to be usable?
Alicia, for your question, yes, I think national laws are very crucial to hold employers accountable. And I think you were referring to more of like home-based workers, right? Where home is their workplace. And we are talking about like in South Asia, there are more than like 50 million home-based workers. And most of them are invisible, as I mentioned, especially when they work in the garment sector for like international clothing brands. It's all about like best practices. And I think it was Thailand in 2010, they actually promulgated a law whereby the employer has to provide a formal contract to their home-based worker working for any industrial unit. So a particular law, a regional law already, like much before this convention and anything else was created, particularly to protect the rights of home-based workers. So yes, governments are duty-bound to ensure these rights, and governments are a like first and foremost recourse to make sure that there are the regional national legislations specifically addressing each. This was specifically for home-based workers, but each sectors of workers have their specific concerns. And at least at the campaign this year, we just focused on 6, and these are very illustrative. Like we focused on domestic workers, agriculture workers, home-based workers, waste pickers, street vendors, and sex workers. But these are just illustrative of the larger issues faced by other informal sectors of informal economy. And this also reminded me of COVID and the fact that we hear a lot about celebrating key workers, essential workers, right? And it's interesting. I came across a stats yesterday where I think 1 in 3 jobs held by women were deemed essential in the US. And these are essential workers. They don't have, again, they work in like underpaid and most high risk jobs. And we are talking about, and we are talking mainly of women of color as well in the US context. So I think we should like broadly look at other sectors, and especially in the wake of COVID, what are the new sectors which are being impacted? I think we really need to like document and study the real impact on all women workers from different sectors.
Yeah, for sure. Anyone have any questions or comments for Simmone or Ardra or both? You could feel free to unmute if you do.
I think I have a question, I guess, that I want to throw out when I think about the informal worker in our context locally. How do you think we can monitor and really ensure that they are protected? I'm very concerned about that because we know that that is almost a whole subculture, and they really aren't protected. There are no benefits, and you may think that they're only domestic workers, but they cross other industries as well. I'm thinking in particular of the construction trade. That's one that's very, very typical of people that aren't really protected as far as benefits and consistency, even with labor law.
Yeah, and I mean, we're talking about street vendors, right? People who sell newspapers, food, hair braiders. So a lot of people in the tourism industry are informal.
Yeah.
selling little souvenirs and things like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And yeah, I've been thinking a lot about informal workers over the past few months and just wondering how are they managing, because they don't have NIB contributions to collect,
Mm-mm.
right? So how are they?
And I
How
know
are
there
they
was a bit of an outcry because I think that there were some statements made in that regard that they wanted them to, and I think that's with the coconut vendors where that whole issue came about, selling the coconut water and trying to make them a part of the formal um, business, structure where they get a business license. So I think they get the vending license to be on the side of the road or something. They should. But I think other benefits should come along with that if they're required to get that, and I don't know. I don't know if that would come under the Small Business Development Center or some other way of offering, maybe getting a grant and being able to offer that type of training for them so they don't feel that they're being forced or targeted, but just laying out the benefits, to the training and then the protections that you provide yourself and your loved ones when you become a part of a formalized system. It's bigger than taxes.
Yeah, I
It's
think for so many people it just doesn't add up.
right.
Like a lot of people just don't make enough money for it to be worthwhile to pay for a business license every year and to be taking out NIB contributions. Like you're literally making enough if you make
Right.
enough
Right.
to do what you got to do, right? Like I can't imagine how much coconuts and coconut water they sell in a day.
Yeah.
They probably have to do something else to turn that money over.
Yeah,
Like,
I mean, and they have to buy supplies. I mean, and so it's almost like six of one, half a dozen the other. You cut your nose off despite the face. But what do I do? I need to eat. I need somewhere to live. I need to buy these supplies because the supplies is what's getting me to eat and live. And
right.
I don't have anything else after that. I mean, so
Especially
it is a
not to
very
pay into like this invisible fund that you think you might never need until you experience a pandemic.
correct, correct, or old age, or illness, right? Because I mean, it's all of these things, all of these eventualities that may happen in your life.
Erin is asking, do unions play a role in shifting workplace culture as well as lobbying for policy and legislation that protects workers?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, they should. They should. I find that they lobby a lot for protecting workers. Yes, I find a lot of times it's more on working conditions and compensation, um, more so than these types of issues. From what I see outside looking in, and never had to work directly with unions, but I know a lot of those bargaining agreements do deal with that, with benefits, compensation, and working conditions.
Yeah.
And the convention talks about it as well.
Okay.
The convention specifically talks about collective bargaining power and freedom of association, where they're talking about
Yes.
worker rights and like the role of trade unions.
Mm-hmm.
Just wanted to add.
Yeah. And they do add that measure of accountability. That's what they're supposed to do. The union is supposed to be that mediator between management and employee, and for the rights of the employee. That's really what they exist for. So I think they ought to be in that roadshow. If we do that route of advocacy, that they need to be a part of the conversation, and the strong role that they play in helping to shift workplace culture and practices. Absolutely.
And then I think we went over the definitions of the world of work and harassment and violence in the workplace. We didn't talk a lot about, or at all about, these little nuances in violence and harassment. Like Simmone, earlier you mentioned like toxic work environments. and recognizing that every form of violence or harassment isn't overt, isn't physical. I think there's a lot of tension in lots of organizations. I mean, how do we address those things? I guess first of all, what are some of those issues that are sort of beneath the surface that aren't getting brought up, that people aren't going to HR to talk about, or to like the dad who owns the business to discuss? What are some of those issues, Simmone? Because I'm sure you've probably seen like a blow up after something has sort of been allowed to fester, right?
Mm-hmm. And one of the areas I saw in this document is psychological. A lot of people don't think about, they only think of harassment as sexual, but you have so many other forms of harassment. And that psychological harassment is when, as you said, it's very undercover. So it's tied to even that verbal abuse, where people are insulting people in very slick ways, right? Saying demeaning comments, diminishing comments, condescending things, name calling, exclusion, right? Excluding people from opportunities, excluding people from meetings. You'd be surprised to know how people say, well, what meeting? I didn't even know, or what training? I didn't even know that was going on. Like they're completely in the dark. And that is a form of harassment. You have people who would use their power to control people's livelihood and to punish people. So you would hear, for instance, and this is a form of retaliation as well, I find. So if you maybe are type of person that you may speak up, you may challenge someone's leadership in the normal course of business, then when you look at your work schedule, maybe you're made to work all nights, or you don't get the days off that you applied for, right? You are treated in some sort of way, and maybe you only get 2 days of work instead of 5. People do these things. They manipulate the system to punish and harass people. And I've had to deal with a case like that, where we literally had to put the manager's feet to the fire, and the staff was able to bring copies of their work schedule and compare. Look, at this is my work schedule after this particular situation would have happened. I reported something, or I just said something, or whatever. After that happened, look at my schedule. Look at everybody else's schedule. I'm working 2 days, they're working 5. But they may say, oh, well, it's slow. We can't have everybody. Why is someone else working 5 days and this person is working 2? So it's very slick. It's very underhanded. And you have to be very vigilant, and you do depend on people reporting it. I mean, it's just, there's only so much you can do. You can't be everywhere at once. And so you need to have a safe place for people to report these types of things.
I think sometimes people discount it as like a personal thing, and not really recognize or acknowledge how it's affecting their work.
Yes.
And something that we don't practice here, at least not that I've seen, is regular assessments or performance review, and being able to do it in both directions. So only when I've worked abroad, I've participated in this sort of performance review where you get your scores, and you're able to give feedback and say whether or not you think the scores are correct, why you think the scores are what they are, and you do the same for your management, and you get to have a conversation. And I think processes like that help you to talk about some of the things that you might not want to raise as an official complaint.
Exactly. Because there are ways you can word it.
Yeah. So I think we can use exercises like that to sort of make it easier for people to report or like non-report in a way that gives human resources and employers the opportunity to address an issue.
Yeah, getting the feedback, right? I mean, that's a form of feedback. And it's happening more, but you're right. It needs to happen on a wider scale, I believe, especially feedback the other way, giving that feedback to managers. And again, it goes back to training managers as well, how to manage, how to lead, and how to ask that question. You know, what do you need more of, less of from me as a leader? How could I support you? How could I manage differently? You know, and a lot of times that takes a lot of emotional intelligence and maturity to ask that question and be able to sit and hear that answer. And we don't see a lot of that happening either, you know. So I do believe that training has a large role to play in just heightening awareness, and then having those measures in the workplace to keep people accountable, like the assessments, and knowing that it isn't just how you spend your budget or you not spend your budget that attributes to your performance as a leader. It should be all these other things as well. You know, I just had some meetings today. I mean, HR can be very draining, and we really are to act as advisors to leaders, and to employees as well, but also to help to coach and guide leaders. And I talk to a lot of leaders who say, you know what, this management thing, this is hard, especially when they have to deal with the people side of that. And so you find that a lot of people are put into management because they have technical ability. They're very skillful in the technical aspects of their work. But the people side of their work is where they need the help, and knowing what to say, how to say, saying very insensitive things, and other things like that really is harassment, and people are just not aware, and they don't know the impact of their words on people. And these are lifetime effects. I know people who need therapy because of their jobs.
Yeah, I think, like you said, a lot of people move through the ranks because they're adept. They're highly skilled in their work, but they're not necessarily trained for the job of managing other people. It's sort of a step that we skip because I think we don't really value that interpersonal
No.
those relationships. We don't really put much value on that. We just like get the job done. It doesn't matter if you like each other. You're not here to be friends. Just like
Exactly. It's an old paradigm that's not working, and we need to change that.
Yeah. Erin, you had your hand up for a while. Do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to just mention an experience. There's a local fast food restaurant that we used to frequent, and we realized that there was a sort of substance abuser, a young man, who would come in and sort of terrorize the staff, but it's very, I don't even want to say it's subtle. They would come in and they would pander inside the store for money, you know, and then say it was food, and then would leave the store and go and buy alcohol, and then would come back in drunk, and there was always a lot of women on shift when he was there, always. And I just, after sort of a couple of months of watching it happen, and having said to the young manager, look, you really have to employ your boss, get your boss to understand that y'all need security here, because it's unfair for your staff to have to work this way. He would come up to the counter and demand food, but not have enough money to pay for it, and get very aggressive. And I don't think that the business has taken it seriously. And it's a popular restaurant with a number of franchises, with a number of other locations. But it's so unfortunate for something that should be so simple, that workers would have to do that. And I'm certain that he feels comfortable because he thinks that there's just a lot of women or very young men, and sort of gender non-conforming men working at the restaurant.
Yeah, just no system in place to respond to some of these sort of everyday issues that some people would be able to anticipate, some people not. But once you see it happening, especially on a consistent basis, it's time to take a look at how you could handle it in a tactful way that doesn't cause a situation to flare up, right, or become any worse, but keeps your staff safe and less stressed that they have to deal with the situation over and over again and manage their own emotions in that space, right? Lauren, you had a comment too, or a question?
Yes. So I know we've spoken a lot about, the smaller businesses, but I just wanted to find out from Ardra and Simmone if you have um, anything you could share about working with larger institutions, because just through my personal experience and experience of former colleagues, sometimes when you want to file a complaint with with HR at a larger institution. So let's say, there are 100 employees or more. It's easy for you to get lost in the process because it's so bureaucratic. And then there is a fear of retaliation because, as you mentioned, Simmone, there are so many persons in senior leadership that aren't really interested in leading. They're just interested in their own, personal gains. They're interested, some are even interested in micromanaging persons, not leading, right? And so I wonder if you could just touch on some of the issues that workers face when they're taking on a very large institution.
I've been talking a lot. Ardra, do you want to go first? This stuff excites me, but you get a turn.
Please go ahead, Simmone. I think
No,
this
go
is very
ahead.
specific to your expertise area. So yeah, I haven't
Okay.
really worked on HR with large organizations. So I would love to hear your comments. Yeah.
Okay. So I have had mixed experiences because in actual fact, I've found that the larger organizations have the structure because they for whatever reasons are more exposed and they know that they ought to have those things in place. And the last place that I worked I must say that they had an extremely good system in place as a large organization. So it had a security department, it had an investigations unit within security. Um, there was an appeals process, there was a grievance process, as well as an appeals process. So you could challenge decisions that were made in certain cases. So I think the structure was there, but you're right that sometimes you can get lost in the bureaucracy of it, getting someone's attention and having them take it seriously. But I think to your point, the biggest thing is that retaliation. People are just deathly afraid to report. That is the largest challenge that I found in the large organization, with the structures, with the policies, with the training. Like all of that is going on. And again, it has to be, we had to make it compliance based. So we had to make it mandatory. So everyone had to go through the training, had to sign off and say, I went through harassment training. Now, of course, again, to your point, how many senior leaders went through it? Like they always want to send the staff, but then they don't want to go. So again, we have to make sure that these policies are for everyone and that the practices is for everyone. I had an experience where I ended up, this is not even a company where I worked. I was referred to the situation as an advisor, really, and ended up coaching a leader who had to, there were allegations against another senior leader who was this person's second in command, allegations of harassment. And this was more of a virtual situation. So I guess it's a small company. So they have these WhatsApp groups, right, to communicate. And so that means now your phone number is exposed. And so the person sent very forward sexual messages to a junior member of staff. And fortunately, that person reported it right away. Well, we assume right away. And she brought the evidence. This is what was texted to me, and I'm very offended by it. But she was also, she didn't address the person because of that person's role in the organization. But fortunately, she did report it to the head. They didn't have HR. She reported it to the head. And my role in that was to support the head on how to handle it, because they didn't have any policies. They didn't have anything in place to deal with it. And so we had to really walk her through that situation. And I don't even think that may have been documented, like on this person's file. They had the conversation, and that was good. And I think the person was just very embarrassed that they were called out. And I haven't heard from it anymore. So I'm assuming that it hasn't happened again, which is good. But you need to have the structure to support, but you need, again, we keep going back to the safe space, the safety element. People need to be able to report. Otherwise, there's nothing that we can do. But I think even in the large organization, you must follow the channels, report. There has to be somebody in the organization that's trustworthy enough for you to file a report with. Someone in leadership. It's critical to be able to do that. And sometimes you may have to decide what is the price that I'm prepared to pay by reporting this. I have a friend who was harassed by her boss. She reported it. And unfortunately for her, she was terminated. She was the one that was terminated, even though the person was found guilty. It didn't happen right away, but obviously she became a target. And at the earliest opportunity, she was terminated from that job. And that wasn't even the end of the story, because after a year after being terminated, she was wondering why she would have interviews, but she would not get a job. Nothing was panning out for her for a year after that termination, until one HR professional told her, she said, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but when we were doing your reference checks, your former employer told us not to bother with you because you're crazy. Because she reported. She had to change her entire career. And it was a grueling, horrific. I mean, I'm skipping out all the details of what that cost her, to change her career. She had to come back to school. She was separated, from her family in order to do that. I mean, there was so much ripple effect from that decision, and it tore her up emotionally, as you can imagine. So I hope that answered the question.
That was uplifting, Simmone.
I know, right? Sorry. But I mean, it's the reality. It's the reality of where we are,
Yeah, it's really rough, because you want to deal with things early on.
Yeah.
And while they're still relatively small, if they start small, because everything doesn't start that way, but within certain structures, it's very difficult and very uncomfortable, and the risk just seems too high. And this is the case in so many different spaces, right? It's the case at work. It's the case if you're experiencing violence at home. You have to have an entire new plan for your life before you can report without having to worry about the backlash of it. So we really have to think through how we design and how we use systems, and designing them in a way that is meant to protect people. Because right now we sort of just add things on, like, oh, we have this policy and we'll add these 3 lines to protect the women. But the policy that you're adding it to is within a system that doesn't work.
Doesn't care. Yeah.
For women. Doesn't care about women, exactly. Or is there to exploit women. Which brings me to another point, I'm very curious about what people think about this, because Simmone, you mentioned something really important earlier about speaking the language of business and going to the data, addressing the numbers, connecting what you want to the bottom line. And I think you made the connection between that and what Ardra was talking about earlier about the number of days that women miss from work because of domestic violence and all that. And there are a lot of debates in feminist spaces about how we use this data to protect women and to advance women's rights. So on one hand, it's the understanding that people care about the economy, people care about money. And on the other hand, it's reducing women to what they produce for the economy and for the capitalist system. And there's a tension between those things. And once we start reducing women to the product of their labor, we sort of play into the objectification of women that leads to other things like rape. So it feels like a slippery slope, even though it feels like the path to efficiently, expeditiously get what we want. So I'm very curious about what people think about that tension and how we navigate it, or how we just completely just don't touch it at all because we don't know what to do with it. And people who are tuned in, please get in the chat. Talk back to us. But does anybody have any thoughts on that? I feel like we're at our last event of 16 days of activism and people are just out of juice. So maybe I'm projecting.
May you just repeat the first part, Alicia?
I really couldn't tell you what I said. It was about the tension between using the product of women's labor to justify their existence and the need to protect them, and what that means when you reduce a woman to the product of her labor.
Right. So how productive she is in terms of the economy, right?
Like how do we navigate that tension between saying, well, we need to protect women because if we don't and they experience domestic violence and they're going to miss all these days at work and it's going to amount to this much loss in the economy. While on the other hand, we're saying women are experiencing sexual violence. They're being raped at high rates because they're being objectified, and we need to stop objectifying women. You know, so it's these are contradictory concepts.
Yes, and they coexist perfectly within capitalist systems, right?
Yes.
So it's almost like for me, the only way to really imagine that tension being absent is the eradication of capitalism altogether.
Well, can we do it tomorrow?
Yeah, we'll get to work on it tonight. But I think perhaps there is an undervaluation of women as workers to begin with. You know what I mean? Like, and that's why so many of them are participating in this informal economy.
And being underpaid.
And being underpaid, right? And doing a lot of the work that holds economies together. But I'm not sure. I just think that when it comes to perceived gender roles and the social and economic spheres, like, I think it's still very difficult for some people to imagine women as workers, you know, or being associated with certain types of work. I think maybe we need to get at that underlying cause of what's seen as quote unquote women's work, right? And what's seen as work.
Yeah, because when you first said women aren't seen as workers, I thought it's the opposite. Like, women have always been seen as workers, and women have done work for so long for free that it's sort of expected now. I can't remember where I was. It was some conference, and these women who were like, C-suite, right? They're all executives. were talking about how every time they had a meeting, it was always the women who were clearing away the glasses of water and stuff at the end of the meeting. You know, and they're in this room, they're with other execs, and the men never think twice about it. They get up, they leave, and the women are like getting all the glasses and going away with them, because we bring the same ideas and values that we have at home. We bring them with us to work. We don't check it at the door. Erin, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I wanted to say that it's even more important for us to interrogate that tension when we have this conversation juxtaposed with the advancement of automation and AI, right? And sort of those that would interpret that tension as requiring the removal of humans, and 2/3 of which are typically women workers, from the labor force, but also sort of in that tension to interrogate what it means when a woman can work for herself, right? Versus in a part of a capitalist machinery. And how does that, well, are we now looking at inherently safer workplaces when women can work for themselves as individuals or collectives? And does it have the potential to disrupt that capitalism, right? That devalues bodies and women's bodies in particular in that way?
Well, that is a question. I don't have the answer. I just saw that Lauren added in the chat that her point of women not being seen as workers is the pervasive invisibilization of women workers, and this idea that removing the glasses at the end of the meeting isn't work that needs to be done. Yeah. Ardra and Simmone, do you have any thoughts on that tension?
I think to Lauren's point about like invisibilization, I was also thinking about unpaid work, how like underpaid. And I think on an average, like globally, 75% of the unpaid work is done by women. So I think, I mean, we have to look at the broader structure, and it's systemic violence that way that's done to women, and these structural policies, it's neoliberalism. So I think we have to actually get into these larger debates to really understand what is going on. And yeah, I don't really have a clear-cut answer, but I just have like more questions than answers here.
Yeah, and I just want to note that you very clearly called the invisibilization of women's work violence. You know, so that just goes back to this broad definition that we have of violence and harassment, and the importance of including all of these things in these definitions. I mean, this came up in the conversation that we had last night, where Aaron Green and Amilcar Sanatan were in conversation about masculinity, having conversations about, you know, gender-based violence, violence against LGBT people, being connected, deeply rooted in these ideas, these toxic, you know, ideas of what masculinity is, what it means to be a man, and the importance of being able to imagine something outside of that, outside of this very limited box that we say that men have to be in order to perform masculinity at its best or at its peak. You know, and it's quite similar violence, harassment, gender-based violence, that we continue to build our definitions as we learn more about how these systemic issues are affecting people's lives every day. Any other thoughts on this, or anything else that we talked about from anybody?
Talking about systemic violence, I just forgot to like add it earlier. It's interesting that I think Lauren brought it up. Brought this point about taking on larger organizations, right? But yeah, I don't really have the expertise to talk from an HR point, and Simmone has covered it very well. But I was actually reminded of informal women workers again, and their main perpetrator of violence is the state in some cases. For instance, street vendors. So just to like, especially in the wake of COVID, just to like, to control as a part of control measures, they have been, denied the access to their trading space. They've been so right to again public space, right to again work is being denied. And they're mainly talking about larger organization. They're like fighting face to face with the state there. And again, talking about sex workers, their work is being criminalized by the state and police and other enforcement mechanisms. So where do they actually go for recourse, right? So I think, yeah, these are like larger questions again that we need to address in this.
Question.
Yeah. Because we've been talking about national policy, state being the main actor, but there are also instances where state is the main perpetrator of violence. So.
Yeah, many, many cases. Even in legislation itself, like existing legislation, we know that all too well in Bahamas. Yeah. Other questions, comments? This is like the last call before I ask Ardra and Simmone for their final comments. All right, final comments, y'all.
Well, I'll go first. I hope that as a result of this and everything that's taken place, and in light of the pandemic and everything else that's just compounding the myriad of issues that we have in our workplaces, that we can actually take action. And I want to publicly commit to you, and I don't know how we will do it, but I do want to commit to taking this further, and how we can, yeah, how we can really raise awareness, perhaps in the first instance, in particular with our HR professionals and people who are touching the workplaces directly, and really not have this as just another night where we have great conversation and we talk about issues and we want to save the world, and then we go to sleep and it's another day. So I want to close by giving you my commitment. However we can all knock our heads together and then take action, I'm prepared to do that.
That's awesome. And I'm looking forward to connecting with you about what we do next, right? Like what the next steps are going to be, because it's going to take some work.
Yeah.
Ardra?
Thanks, Alicia. It was a lot to reflect for the day. And I think I learned a lot too, especially from like the HR mechanisms in place. So we were thinking more in terms of, larger issues, but all these micro concerns came into the picture, like in our discussion today. And from my end, yeah, I think we should continue to remain engaged with all these issues. And there, I'm actually inviting all of you to call for the ratification of this convention. That's a minimum where we can actually start with. And yes, we are wrapping up the campaign in 2 days, the 16 days, but we are not stopping with 16 days. We are going to talk about 365 days of activism. And from the Global 16 Days campaign standpoint, we'll be engaging with more national level activities. Especially we've been working with women's rights organization in Nepal, like pushing for the ratification of the convention there. Hopefully we'll be able to share more updates in the weeks and months ahead. But I think at an individual level and more like collectively, I think women's rights activists, advocates, HR professionals, state entities, everybody, UN entities, everybody have to come together, and we have to be on the same page on this, that, this is gender-based violence in the world of work is unacceptable by any means. So I think we should just agree on that. And again, it's like, I invite you all to like continue the activism, not just stop with just these 16 days. And I've shared some of these resources in the chat box. We have a campaign advocacy guide where, we clearly describe each sector and what are the specific issues faced by each sector. And it also has an action guide where it talks about different action points that you can, say, engage with your state actors, to engage with journalists. So I think that's also how do we, as Simmone was talking about, raising awareness. Maybe just say writing op-eds about the issue, creating more awareness on that front, right? Like, so journalists are a very important constituency in terms of that. So I think it should be all about awareness and moving from just awareness to also demanding accountability, I guess. So I'll close with that. Thanks for having me here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Simmone and Ardra, for joining us for this conversation. I think you both brought so much to this. And I think in some spaces we went deep and in some spaces we went wide. And I like when there's like a good mix of deep and wide. And the resources that you're sharing, Ardra, are in the chat. I'm going to save the chat and we will make sure that we drop those links in the event page, the 16 Days of Activism event page, where we've been dropping all of the other resources. And we will be sharing more about the International Labour Organization's Convention 190. We provided like a one-page cheat sheet to Simmone and Ardra just to make it a little bit easier because the convention is kind of lengthy. It's very easy reading. It's not super technical language, but we wanted to have like a one page with the main points. So we'll share that publicly so that you can kind of at a glance get a feel for what the convention is all about. And as Ardra said, push for ratification and don't expect that to be the only thing that you have to do. So we'll agitate for ratification of Convention 190, but we're also going to work with Simmone and figure out how we can get companies, organizations on board. What should our strategies look like? So we're going to start building those out in the weeks and the months to come. This is the final event for this year's 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence for Equality Bahamas, but there will be other events run by other organizations in the region and all over the world. You can check out 16dayscampaign.org. Is that right, Ardra? 16dayscampaign.org.
Yes, 16 Days Campaign. You're on social media as well.
Yeah, and see all of the organizations that you can tune into. One thing that COVID-19 has done is basically made everything accessible, aside from the little time zone differences. But tune into some of the other events that other people have going on, see what you can learn and bring to our context here at home. And this will likely be our last event for the calendar year. We will see you again in January for Women's Wednesdays, which is usually the first Wednesday of the month. But I think in January, it will probably be the second, just to give us some breathing room after the new year and the celebrations and lamenting the way that people's wallets and bank accounts look as we do in January. Other than that, follow us everywhere. Equality242 is the handle. And I think that's it. Have a great evening and stay tuned to us on social media. We'll continue sharing more information about ILO, C190, as well as other women's rightsy things. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.